Hey, one of the factors that I left out of the last lecture on the age of exploration comes a little bit later. It comes about 30 years after Columbus's voyage, and this is in 1519. And what we're going to see here that becomes a factor in especially carving out the New World into colonies is the Protestant Reformation. Um, Now, before we go into this, something that you kind of need to get about the Christian church at the time. Everybody in the Christian church prior to 1519 would be what we would consider Catholics. That's the mother church, the core of the church, the extent of the church. All of those people would be what we would consider Catholics. The Protestant Reformation is a protest against some of the dogma and actions of the Catholic Church. And so every other Christian religion or every other Christian denomination that you've heard of, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopal somewhat, um, Mennonites, Amish even, Lutherans, all of those people are Protestants. They were protesting what was going on with the Catholic Church. And, at some point, the Protestants all kind of split apart and they formed their own denominations. But for right now, in 1500, let's say, in 1500, if you are a Christian, you are what we would consider a Catholic. Uh, and what I'm about to describe, it's a very small event on its face. It's really not a tremendous thing when we get this rolling. It's just it accumulates and becomes something much, much larger. Um, Also, other people had been disagreeing with the Catholic Church for over several centuries even. Um, at the time, though, just like we had with the Age of Exploration, timing is everything. If Martin Luther would have done this stuff 200 years before, he would have been considered a heretic, and he was a heretic. He's disagreeing with what the Catholic Church is laying down. But if he would have done this 200 years before, he would have been a heretic. And at the time, we burn heretics at the stake. And so he would have gotten in a tremendous amount more trouble than what he does ultimately get into. So, and he also, another thing to keep in mind is that he doesn't sort of roll out of bed one morning and think, hey, I'm going to tear down the Catholic Church. That's not at all his intent. His honest intent is to reform it. He wants to fix what he sees is wrong with the Catholic Church. And so, it's not his intent to send everything into an upheaval sort of state. That's not what he's doing. But what happens, and we'll have some background on some of this terminology here in just a second, but what really gets this rolling is in 1516, 3 years before we kind of arrive at the Protestant Reformation, a man named Johann Tetzel was preaching an indulgence. He was trying to sell indulgences in Germany, and I'll explain what indulgences are in a second. But the motive for doing this at the time was to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica down in Rome. The building was extremely, extremely old. It was about 1,200 years old at this point. It was structurally unsound, and it needed some major, major renovations, or it was just going to crumble. And it's kind of wild because St. Peter's was originally built in around 300 AD at the time of Constantine, and so this is a over 1,000-year-old building that we need to renovate, and that's an expensive proposition. Um, Understandably, this is a super historic building. The Pope originally intended just to preserve it. Unfortunately, it was too far gone. It was structurally unsound. It was going to collapse. One of the architects at the time in 1516 said that it was a structural abomination. And he said that one of the walls, walls are supposed to be vertical. One of the walls had gone 6 feet out of vertical. So it was leaning massively. And that particular architect noted down that I have no doubt that it will eventually, some slight movement will make it collapse. And so St. Peter's Basilica, the mother church of Christianity, is on the verge of collapse. And so we're trying to collect funds to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. So to kind of take an aside really quick, we're selling what are called indulgences to try to finance this. These were fairly common in medieval Catholicism. They unfortunately get pretty bloated as time moves on. Originally, an indulgence, the idea of this was that if you're a Catholic, there are sins that you commit over your life, and not all of them are fully removed. You can pray, you can make donations to the church, you can, engage in religious practices, go on pilgrimage. You still might have some leftover sin that is weighting down your soul. And so, if that happens to you after death, you go to purgatory. Instead of going to heaven or hell, you arrive in purgatory. It's sort of a holding tank. And over time, hopefully, your soul will be purged of those infractions and you'll move on to heaven. Indulgences work off some of that time in purgatory. So, for example, when we talked about the Black Death earlier, those people that were sick and infected with the bubonic plague, they didn't have time to engage in pilgrimages. They were going to die within a few hours. And so the Pope, grants them indulgences. You don't have time to set yourself right before possibly going to purgatory, we understand. So those leftover sins are going to be waived. That's the way it started. But over time, this gets corrupted by the church, and it becomes less a way to get out of purgatory and more of a money-making venture. Hey, I can sell people the ability to not remain in purgatory. You may remain in purgatory for 1,000,000 years. Who knows? I might be able to help you get out of that. And so this becomes a money-making venture. A fantastic example of this is there is a cathedral in Rouen, France. And in this cathedral, there is the so-called butter tower, literally butter like you put on burnt biscuits. At the time, the church banned the consumption of butter during the holiday of Lent. Well, we're in France. Nobody wants to give up their butter. And so in order to raise money, the church sold for 6 deniers. You could consume butter during Lent if you would make this donation. And so ultimately, the church collected so much money during this particular period of Lent that they had enough money to build this tower onto this cathedral, and so it becomes the butter tower because that's what financed it. Moving on to St. Peter's, though, that we're doing the same thing. We're selling indulgences to reconstruct St. Peter's Basilica. Well, that rankles Martin Luther. He is increasingly arriving at this point that the Catholic Church used to, and I'm not sure if they still engage in this or not, but they believed at the time that good works were something that you could do to somehow get you credit in the eyes of God. Martin Luther doesn't agree with that, and most Protestants today do not agree with, good works do not count for anything. It's the grace of God that gets you to heaven according to that ideology. And Luther's upset about this. Selling indulgences, these are good works. You're doing something to try to get you credit with God. And so in October of 1517, Luther posted 95 theses, arguments against the indulgences, on a door of a castle church in Wittenberg. This is not revolutionary. He's not got there yet. He's a religious professor at a local college, and it's not unusual for professors to put, a pamphlet on a door announcing that they disagree with something and they're going to debate this idea in front of the public. And that's what he's doing here. He is disagreeing with indulgences, and he says, hey, I'm going to hold a public forum against indulgences. You want to, come and see the show? That's great. People did that, but he is stepping in the direction of becoming more and more revolutionary. One of his arguments is that the church councils have endorsed indulgences, and Luther is arguing that these are not, something that we should allow within the Christian / Catholic Church. And so, in saying that, he's denying the authority of church councils to have indulgences, to issue these things. The Pope also has endorsed indulgences. And so he's denying the authority of the Pope by saying we should not have indulgences. He's denying the authority of the Pope in, granting these things. Now, a big thing, and it seems like a weird little technicality, but we are, it's one of those slippery slope things. Technically, he's only arguing on this issue. He's only saying that the Pope and these church councils cannot issue indulgences. This is the only thing they don't have authority in. But, it's one of those slippery slope kind of arguments that if we agree that the Pope doesn't have this authority, on what other factors does the Pope not have authority? Later on, he issues another treatise, and this one is on the freedom of a Christian man. And in this one, a big thing, he argues that salvation is based on faith and grace alone. Good works don't do anything at all. So your purchasing indulgences doesn't do anything in the slightest for your eternal soul. It's just, your faith in God and the grace of God that allows you to go to heaven. That's it. Rome condemns a lot of these. So Luther issued 95 original theses. Rome condemns 41 of them. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And they were trying to get him to kind of bend a little bit. Hey, we agree that there's some things that we might reform, but you can't just say we need to get rid of everything that we're doing here. Martin Luther refuses. He says that these things are problems that I have with the church. I would like to see them reformed, and he refuses to back down. And so in 1521, a year after that, on the freedom of a Christian man, Pope Leo X excommunicates Martin Luther. And like I said, he's really not trying to, break apart the church. He's really trying to reform it instead of, trying to break it down. But, what he's done is created the basic doctrine of Protestantism. Basically, they protest. They don't agree with, what is now the Catholic Church, and so they're arguing against it. A major thing, though, we're not quite still, burning heretics and stuff. We can make life difficult for them, but one of the things that allows Martin Luther to really kind of stick around and not just be, removed from power and possibly, maybe even killed by some faction of the church, is that Martin Luther is up in Northern Europe and he lives in Germany. He's protected by some German nobility. Some of the German nobility agrees with Martin Luther. They don't buy into the indulgence thing. They're not completely jiving with the Catholic Church. And so he's offered protection by them. And that protection really, allows for this remarkable event because, you know, other people were doing the same thing much, much earlier, but they get killed for it. And Martin Luther, because of the time period, also because of his protection by these nobles, uh, we actually have two different forms of Christianity that are emerging in Europe. And that happens in 1519 is when that really starts, and it'll generate more and more interest as we move on. But kind of segueing from that age of exploration, now not only do we have people in Europe, countries in Europe that are competing with each other. France has claims in the New World, and Spain has some claims in the New World, and England has some claims in the New World, and those are the big dominant countries. You're also having some Catholic versus Protestant claims in the New World. And so Spain and Portugal are primarily are Catholic countries, and France is up in the air a little bit. They have majority Catholic, but they do have some Protestant segments of their population. England is very quickly going to become Protestant, and so there's this competition, not only between countries, but also we need to spread the Protestant religion or we need to spread the Catholic religion. And so not only do we have some religious ideology emerging here, but it also is going to add to European rivalry in that department. So thanks.